Hello and welcome to In Your Mind, a podcast that delves into the heart of issues facing our communities. I'm your host, Ligia Parodi, from the European Network of People Who Use Drugs. Today, we are tackling a difficult but essential topic, gender-based violence within the community of people who use drugs. We know this violence disproportionately affects women and gender diverse people, but the solution that requires all of us, including men. This episode is called Our Shared Responsibility. We are moving beyond the theory to have a real, grounded conversation about harmful masculinities and what it truly means for men to become allies. We have two incredible guests with us today. First, Ricardo Fuertes, a specialist in gender, masculinities, harm reduction, and sexual health, who will help us frame the issue. And second, Rui Coimbra, a man from our European community and president of the Drug Users Association in Portugal, CASO, who will share his personal journey and reflections with raw honesty. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being part of this. Let's start at the beginning. Ricardo, in what context did you start getting involved in discussions about gender?
Vijay, thank you so much for the invitation, and this is a very interesting topic. As a gay man working in harm reduction and HIV services, I started to be requested to take part in discussions, mostly to address drugs and gender, but it was always framed as women who use drugs and LGBTQI persons who use drugs. And then I was called to talk about men who have sex with men, chemsex, gay and bisexual men using drugs. And my surprise was that very rarely, very few times, it was also mentioned that cisgender men, heterosexual men, or those who present like this also have a gender, and they use drugs and use substances also in a gendered way. And working in harm reduction, for me, this was very visible. So I saw men in services using drugs more heavily, in a more risky way, performing more violence and suffering also more violence. And when I arrived to conferences, discussions, I wondered, why isn't gender being discussed in this context? And that's how I arrived in context, in situations where I also brought the need to address masculinities in men and cisgender men and straight men, although I'm not straight, but I thought it would be important to talk about it.
And Rui, how was this topic? How did this topic arose in your life? Do you relate to this?
Yeah, totally. I have sisters, I have mother and daughter, and when I arrived at CASO, I began to feel a little surrounded only by cis men, and there was a culture, a subculture, almost inside of that small bubble of drug users that still was dealing with the inclusion of women and LGBTQA trans people, everyone. How could CASO, since drugs are used by a very diverse group in societies, so it affects, it's transversal to all groups in society. And so how could still today, with human rights, with some liberty and some thought on things and equality, how come that still there was so much inequality and almost without self-awareness? There's a need for everyone to find new ways of expressing gender. So also for men, it's very important to be more aware of that, more aware of micro-violences that occur daily, even by the peers that are informed. So when we talk about the population, the violence it's something atrocious. It's cruel. Yeah.
Let me go back to Ricardo now and dig a bit more. Ricardo, what do we know about the impact of gender on drugs-related violence or risk of violence?
Yes, well, gender has definitely an impact. Well, in the way people use drugs, as said before. So we know there's higher rate of injection, higher rates of overdose, but also violence, as you suggested. So men are more exposed to violence, both as people who perform violence, but also people who suffer violence. And we know that under the effects of drugs and alcohol, it's more probable there's higher probability that this violence is severe and more extreme. But I would like to go a little bit beyond the individual and interpersonal forms of violence that we see daily, to think about more structural forms of violence that people who use drugs, especially the ones who live in more precarious situations, face. So we see poverty, homelessness, violence from police, inequality, imprisonment, and criminalization. I think this also plays a role in this context, if we see violence in a wider way. So I think, for example, in harm reduction settings, we tend to normalize violence that people suffer. So it's quite common to hear somebody that throughout the day could have been humiliated, insulted, beaten. The person itself has beaten somebody. Some days maybe have seen somebody die in, let's say, serious situations with overdose. Other things have seen accidents. Many people experience pain, for example, and sometimes because it's so present and so overwhelming, we tend to think it's normal, and it's not. So people are exposed to incredible amounts of trauma and suffering, and I think that's why also there's this combination between violent suffering and not feeling, and using substances not to feel, and this mix of not feeling emotions, but also sometimes not feeling physical things, not feeling the body, not feeling if it's cold, if it's if I have pain, if I cannot walk, this kind of thing. So I think this is really a combination of violent suffering and substance use in a gendered way, because it also affects men sometimes in a higher amount, but women in a particular situation, LGBTQI people also with some specificity. So they all experience all this that I mentioned in different ways, but for sure we have to think about masculinities in this equation.
Rui, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'd just say that about the mission of CASO, that I don't know if people know, but it's Consumers Associated Survive Organized, and its mission is to promote health and rights and dignity of people that use drugs, particularly those that are in the most extreme biopsychosocial circumstances and vulnerabilities, and many times in cities there are different maps, different cities, different ways of living the city, and so groups and universities almost don't touch and don't interact and don't, or the interactions are on the borders, on the extremes, and when there's a robbery or something. But public services have a responsibility. And so I think services have to also be rethinked. An evaluation must be done, and I think this moment can be of a certain evaluation of things. Also, men that use drugs and that are in treatment or are in the community, I think there's a moment where this anger and this hate and this difficulties of coping have to be this darkness, this well without end. It has to be addressed, and I see many possibilities for the story not to be a story of the junkie and the drugs lived only on that level of extreme, but I can see perfectly informed people and informed users doing use of drugs more peacefully if they were legal.
Let's talk now about the initiatives that aim to eliminate violence. And the most well-known is the United Nations campaign, the 16 Days of Action to Eliminate Violence Against Women. And specifically in the drug user community, there has been a specific campaign, the Everwood campaign, the elimination of violence against women who use drugs, that follow the same 16 days of action as the United Nations campaign. Everwood campaign is for women, with women, especially targets the participation of women. We have very good reason to do it like this. Why is it not enough to leave this work to women? Why must men be actively involved in what is at its core a feminist issue?
Yes, of course, men are actors and very, very important actors on this. So we must be involved very actively, and for sure this is must be a priority. Well, I think events like you mentioned are very important to call attention for special days, special moments of the year. But I think it's also important to work continuously throughout the year. There are more and more initiatives and groups discussing gender, new masculinities, men thinking that we cannot stay on this as if it's not about us as also. So I think it's quite important. Well, as Rui said, I think it's a difficult moment to discuss gender because it's the narrative is so contaminated. So if we go online on the internet, if we try to search for information, we will find interesting things, but also things that are completely out of, very conservative, denying gender, very aggressive. So it's a return of a very negative, toxic, conservative masculinity. But okay, let's try to react to that. I think we all need to understand that we could do something different. We can go beyond expectations. We can perform our masculinity in different ways. Not only people who, let's say, behave more violently, but also all of us that somehow are part of it, who observe, who are a bit, who accept some kinds of violence, maybe subtle violence, maybe an offense, maybe a sign, things that are not so explicit. I think we all have a role, and I can give you an example from harm reduction. For many years, I'm Portuguese, and I've worked in Spain and Portugal, and for many years, I thought it was normal to hear an homophobic insult, to see a sexist attitude, and say, okay, it's normal, it's a bit cultural, it's normal that, it's part of life. And then I recently moved to France, and I was working there in a harm reduction service as well. And I saw a completely different attitude when something homophobic is said or sexist, or the team stops immediately and says, this is unacceptable, this is not okay, this is not legal. So we have to act immediately in a very robust way. And I'm sure some things are better in Portugal, others in France, others in Spain. What I want to highlight is this, with this example, is that we are all a bit part of a culture of violence. We part of it, victims of it. So we for sure have to deconstruct, think about what we are doing, be critical, act, respond, engage. While also embrace people who might be doing something that it's not okay, and say, okay, let's try to do something different. So yes, we are definitely part of the solution as well.
Specifically, Ricardo, what should be the role of the local services, the harm reduction services in this area? What could they do? What else should they do?
Well, harm reduction, I think, has a very important role. So we also, myself as a harm reduction worker, we are very close to the communities, very, well accepted. We understand well the needs of people who use drugs. So I think we can go beyond providing medical services and beyond providing needles or providing methadone. And I think for some time, I think that happened, and we see some consequences of people with all the medical needs kind of fulfilled, but then feeling lonely, feeling a little bit without something to do with their time. So there's already some understanding that harm reduction could go beyond providing medical services. But if we go through the gender discussion, of course, we could be providing opportunities to discuss this kind of things, to be more vulnerable, to talk about feelings, for example, that it's something that it's key when talking about masculinities or alternative masculinities. But I think we also have to acknowledge that we are facing very difficult times. So there are massive cuts in harm reduction funding. Also political pressure, harm reduction that it's performed in cities is being taken out of cities due to gentrification. So it's the perfect storm, a lot of difficulties. So I think it's also a little bit unfair to ask to harm reduction to also, take the step and go beyond and also address gender. One more thing to address beyond infectious diseases and overdose crisis and housing crisis. So we have a lot of problems to deal with. But one of the things that I think we need to avoid is to become really like good, extremely efficient service providers, only doing the standardized harm reduction intervention without thinking about what we are doing, trying to bring complexity to the table, being critical. And I think it's difficult to do because with the lack of funding, working in harm reduction became very precarious as well. Sometimes only people who are looking for a job for some time and then they leave, and then sometimes people don't have experience or have critical thinking. So I brought a lot of issues to the table, but definitely harm reduction has a role and needs to become sometimes more political in the sense of discussing the real nature of the problems, the roots of violence, the roots of inequality, getting involved in all things that are happening in society. So I think we can do that, although the context is not so easy. And
for our listeners, especially the men listening, who are feeling motivated but don't know where to start, let's talk about our call to action. Rui, from your perspective, what are the practical, everyday actions men who use drugs can take to make this shift?
Well, that's things that are so basic, like stop physical violence, uh, stop. Most of us have to work first with ourselves, quite quite a bit, I think, before anything like being able to reach any other uh, situation or context and being with some fresh mind or with some ability or capacity to not being engaged and overwhelmed by the old narratives, and people get hooked to the narrative that works for them, and so there's lots of contexts, micro contexts where all of us can be building. I mean, like Ricardo was saying also that always things are happening and we have to act and react and do and build, and violence is increasing. The level of violence is completely increasing. So even for conservative people, if they want to avoid crime, if they want to avoid violence, if they want to decrease these parallel impacts of poverty and of using drugs, it's very important to decriminalize full decriminalization, not this kind of let's sanction here because otherwise we cannot be under CND and under the international laws.
Right. We are nearly the end of our conversation. Would you like to add something that has escaped before?
Yes. Well, I would like to finish by thanking you by this initiative. I think it's important to discuss this topic, and I hope you don't mind. Before starting, we were saying, are we specialists on gender? Are we specialists on violence? Should we say that or not? And I think it's important not to be afraid of talking about this, even if we are not fully specialists, even if we don't have a degree on gender or whatever. And I've seen many times people, for example, afraid of talking about LGBTQI plus issues, let's say, because they are afraid of the terminology, they don't know the pronouns. And I think this is limiting discussions. I think we are always talking about the experience of being humans, dealing with humans, trying to navigate society, ourselves, trying to overcome the problems that we are all facing. And yes, why not? We should talk about this, even if sometimes we're not using the perfect terminology or the perfect concepts. We are all trying to understand and figuring out how to make the world a little bit easier and better. So thank you.
Totally. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your courage, your honesty, and your insights today. This has been In Your Mind with Ricardo Fuertes and Rui Coimbra. If this conversation resonated with you, please share this episode, follow the podcast, and join the conversation. The fight to end gender-based violence is our shared responsibility. It's a core part of harm reduction, and it's a core part of building the compassionate community we all deserve. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other.